By the end of 1942, the Kriegsmarine submarine arm was facing something of a problem. Losses were rising as the widespread deployment of ASDIC before the war had made U-boats favour attacks on convoys on the surface at night. But now the widespread deployment of radar on ships and aircraft, as well as increasingly accurate high-frequency direction finding, was making this approach costly as well. Although some German submarines were having luck surviving incoming attacks by running extremely deep, this didn't help them actually attack anything, partially because they couldn't hope to get either an accurate lock or launch torpedoes that deep down, and because the submarine's underwater speed was such that if a U-boat was forced to remain underwater for any particularly long period of time, even a slow convoy would outpace it. But there did seem to be a solution. What we would today call air-independent propulsion using the Walter engine. But the issues with safely using large amounts of hydrogen peroxide in an enclosed environment whilst under fire still needed to be worked out. But some German designers had a brainwave. If they took the hull that had been designed for the new propulsion system, they could make some quick and easy changes and have a submarine ready much sooner. The hydrogen peroxide sub had been configured with a double pressure hull. A large upper hull held the propulsion, weapons and crew, and a smaller lower hull held the fuel, and the whole thing was then wrapped in a casing that was far more optimised for underwater travel than surface sailing. The reasoning was that if they just packed the lower hull full of batteries, and the upper hull was then configured like a normal diesel-electric submarine, the resulting vessel would have a massive battery capacity and would therefore be able to either stay submerged for days at a time, which would allow it to outlast escorts who would sometimes just hover over a particularly elusive sub and wait for it to run out of power, or allow the sub, assuming powerful enough electric motors were fitted, to proceed at great speed underwater, which would allow the submarine to catch up with a convoy while remaining submerged, and also actually outrun a good chunk of the corvettes and sloops that were being used to escort the merchantmen. Although the Kriegsmarine generally preferred smaller subs, and a double-hull sub was necessarily somewhat larger, it did offer a solution to the increasing casualties in the U-boat arm, and it utilised a lot of existing construction methods, and so in theory could be made to enter service considerably more rapidly. By mid-1943, the big ocean-going design was finalised, dubbed the Type 21. It displaced a little over 1,600 tons on the surface and added about 200 tons to that when it was submerged, and was fitted with 3 drive systems, a pair of diesel engines that ran at around 4,000 shaft horsepower, give or take, a pair of main electric drive motors that ran at an even more powerful 5,000 shaft horsepower, again, give or take, and another pair of much smaller electric motors, only capable of around 225 shaft horsepower. These were to either allow the submarine to crawl around silently at around 6 knots for extreme stealth, or to provide some headway on the surface or at snorkel depth while the diesels devoted their power to charging the main batteries. If using diesel propulsion, you had a surface speed of about 15.5 knots, and the main electric drives underwater gave a top speed of around 17 knots. Armament consisted of 6 bow torpedo tubes with 17 reloads and 6 torpedoes preloaded in the tubes. No deck gun was fitted, as the submarine was supposed to be attacking purely from underwater, but a couple of 20mm anti-aircraft guns were allocated for air defence should the submarine be caught on the surface by enemy aircraft. Due to its size, a much smaller Type 23 design was also presented that would work much better in coastal waters, but that's another subject for another video. The next problem was production. It usually took around 1.5 to 2 years for Germany to get a U-boat into commission from keel laying, and by the end of 1943 it was clear that this amount of time would be far too late, even if you skipped the prototype stage in between. Instead, it was decided to try and build the submarines in canal transportable modules in different places around Germany. These could then be built en masse and in parallel, and then all transported for final assembly in a shipyard, hopefully cutting the build time down to around 6 months, as well as making the submarines less vulnerable to being bombed, since they wouldn't be in the shipyards for quite as long. On paper, this seemed to work relatively well, and the first submarine of the type, U-2501, commissioned in June 1944, with a total of 119 eventually being commissioned. Unfortunately, despite being loaded with every bit of new technology relevant to Axis submarines, or perhaps because of that, there were also major problems. Numerous quality control issues forced the cancellation or prolonged delay of almost twice as many submarines as actually made it into service, and Allied bombing efforts still managed to wreck parts or whole subs in another 60 cases. The complexity of the new submarines also meant that even those that actually made it into the water needed at least half a year to get their crews up to speed with their operations. And the Allies also then began dropping mines into the training areas, and as an overall result, only U-2511 managed a short war patrol, being at sea for 5 days at the end of April and beginning of May 1945 before Germany surrendered. U-3008 also managed to sail 2 days before the war ended, but this was largely to escape artillery bombardment of Wilhelmshaven, not so much for an active war patrol. U-3523 would become the last German-built sub lost in combat operations, as it was sunk the day after the German surrender. She, along with U-3503 and U-534, seemed to have been heading for South America when they were caught by liberators. U-534 was bombed and sunk the previous day, and U-3503 would scuttle herself 2 days afterwards. Post-war, the various Allied powers took over a number of Type 21s and would use them either in active service or as research vessels to inform their own submarine development programs, with the scuttled U-2540 eventually being salvaged and inducted into the West German Navy during the Cold War, before eventually becoming a museum ship in Bremerhaven, where she remains to this day.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.